My name is Isabella Brown. I'm 32 years old, and I need to tell you about the day my entire world turned upside down. You know that feeling when you think you know your family's story? When you've spent years building your life on what you believe is the truth, only to discover it was all built on lies? Well, that's exactly what happened to me when the lost family member who came back after 20 years was hiding a shocking secret that changed everything I thought I knew about my past. 3 weeks ago, I received a letter that made my hands shake so badly I almost dropped it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the name at the bottom made my heart stop. Uncle Marcus, my mother's brother who disappeared when I was 12 years old, was alive and wanted to meet me. Before I go any further, I need to ask you something that's been on my mind since all of this happened. Have you ever had someone vanish from your life without explanation, leaving behind nothing but questions and a hole that never quite heals? If you have, or if you're curious about what happens when ghosts from the past suddenly become real again, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Because what I'm about to share with you is a journey through betrayal, secrets, and a truth so devastating it nearly destroyed what was left of my family. I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll understand why some secrets are buried deep, and why sometimes the people we think abandoned us were actually protecting us from something far worse. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment of what happened next. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the moment everything changed. It was a Tuesday afternoon, one of those ordinary days where you're just going through the motions, thinking about what to make for dinner or whether you need to stop at the grocery store on the way home. I was sitting at my kitchen table, sorting through the usual pile of bills and junk mail, when I saw the envelope with no return address and handwriting that looked like it came from another era. Something about it made me pause, made my instincts scream that opening it would change everything. And I was right, because inside was a single-page letter that began with the words I never thought I'd read. Dear Isabella, I know you probably think I'm dead, but I'm not. And it's time you knew the truth about why I left. My Uncle Marcus had been gone for 20 years, vanished without a trace when I was just a kid trying to understand why adults sometimes just disappear from your life. I remember the day he left like it was yesterday, even though I was only 12 years old at the time. One morning he was there at our family breakfast, laughing and making jokes, ruffling my hair and promising to teach me how to play guitar. And by that evening, he was gone. My mother refused to talk about him. My father would change the subject whenever his name came up. And eventually, I learned to stop asking questions because the silence that followed was more painful than not knowing. For 2 decades, I carried that absence with me like a weight, wondering if I'd done something wrong, if he'd left because of me, if he'd ever think about the niece he left behind. But now, holding that letter in my trembling hands, I realized that everything I'd been told, every assumption I'd made, every tear I'd cried over his absence might have been based on a lie. The letter was short, cryptic, asking me to meet him at a small cafe downtown the following Saturday at 2 in the afternoon. He wrote that he understood if I didn't want to see him, that he knew he had no right to ask anything of me after all these years, but that there were things I needed to know before it was too late. My first instinct was to crumple the letter and throw it away, to protect myself from the pain of reopening old wounds. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and the questions I'd buried for 20 years suddenly demanded answers. So I made a decision that would lead me down a path I never could have imagined. Growing up without Uncle Marcus was like living in a house with a room that was permanently locked, where everyone pretended it didn't exist but you could feel its presence every single day. Can you relate to that feeling of having a missing piece in your family puzzle, where everyone acts like everything is normal but you know something important has been erased from your story? If this resonates with you, do me a favor and smash that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me about your own family mysteries because sharing these stories helps us all feel less alone in our pain. I spent my entire teenage years and 20s trying to fill the void that Marcus left behind, looking for father figures in teachers and coaches, searching for that unconditional acceptance I remembered feeling from him during those brief 12 years we had together. Every birthday, every graduation, every important moment in my life, I felt his absence like a phantom limb, something that should have been there but wasn't. My mother, Sarah, had completely shut down any conversation about her brother from the moment he disappeared. I remember being 13, sitting at the dinner table, innocently mentioning something about Uncle Marcus, and watching my mother's face drain of color before she stood up and left the room without saying a word. My father, David, had gently explained that some topics were too painful to discuss, that Marcus had made choices that hurt our family deeply, and that the kindest thing we could do was respect my mother's wishes and never speak his name again. So I learned to carry my questions silently, to wonder in private why the man who had been so present in my childhood could just vanish like smoke. It was like he'd been erased from our family history, photos removed from albums, his name edited out of stories, as if pretending he never existed would somehow make the pain of his absence hurt less. The absence shaped me in ways I didn't fully understand until I was much older. I became someone who held people at arm's length, terrified that anyone I let get close would eventually disappear, just like Uncle Marcus did. My relationships were shallow and short-lived, because I couldn't shake the belief that abandonment was inevitable, that people leave and they don't come back, and that loving someone deeply just gives them more power to destroy you when they go. Think of it like this. Imagine building a house on ground where a sinkhole once appeared. You can construct the most beautiful home, but you'll always be waiting for the ground to open up beneath you again. That's how I lived my life for 20 years. Always waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the people I cared about to reveal that they were temporary, just like Marcus had been. I used to lie awake at night as a teenager, creating elaborate stories in my head about where he might have gone and why. Maybe he was a secret agent who had to disappear to protect us from dangerous enemies. Maybe he'd fallen in love with someone my family didn't approve of and had to choose between us and his happiness. Maybe he'd committed some terrible crime and was on the run from the law. These fantasies were easier to bear than the alternative, which was that maybe he just didn't love us enough to stay, that we weren't worth the effort of maintaining contact, that I wasn't important enough to deserve an explanation. The not knowing was torture, a constant itch I couldn't scratch, a question mark that hung over my entire life story and made it impossible to ever feel truly settled or secure. By the time I hit my 30s, I thought I'd made peace with never knowing what happened to Uncle Marcus. I'd built a life, carved out a career as a graphic designer, made a small circle of friends who I kept at a safe emotional distance, and convinced myself that I was fine, that the past was the past, and that some questions don't need answers. But that letter proved I'd been lying to myself all along, because the moment I saw his name, every single emotion I'd suppressed for 20 years came flooding back with overwhelming force. The anger, the hurt, the confusion, the desperate need to understand why he left, it all crashed over me like a wave, and I realized that I'd never truly moved on at all. I'd just become very good at pretending the wound didn't exist while it quietly festered beneath the surface, waiting for exactly this moment to rip open again. But here's the thing. I had no idea that the truth he was about to reveal would make me wish I'd never asked those questions in the first place, because some secrets, once uncovered, can never be buried again. That Saturday morning before the meeting, I woke up at 5 a.m., even though my alarm wasn't set until 7, my mind racing with 1,000 different scenarios about what might happen when I finally saw Uncle Marcus again. Would I recognize him after 20 years? Would he look old and broken? Or would he still have that same mischievous smile I remembered from my childhood? I must have changed my outfit 4 times, trying to find something that said, "I'm doing fine without you," while also not looking like I was trying too hard to impress a ghost from my past. The cafe he'd chosen was a small, quiet place on the edge of town that I'd never been to before, which made me wonder if he'd picked it specifically because it held no memories, no history, just neutral ground where we could meet as almost strangers. As I drove there, my hands were shaking so badly I almost had to pull over twice, and I kept asking myself if I was making a huge mistake by opening this door that had been closed for so long. Here's what I need you to think about while I continue this story. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew that taking one more step forward would change everything? Where you stood at a crossroads, knowing that whatever choice you made, there was no going back? If you're invested in finding out what happened when I walked into that cafe and came face to face with the man who'd haunted my thoughts for 2 decades, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because what happens next is something I still have trouble believing actually happened. I also want to hear from you in the comments. Would you have gone to that meeting? Or would you have protected yourself by staying away and leaving the past buried? Your perspective matters to me because going through this alone was one of the hardest things I've ever done, and knowing that others understand makes the weight a little lighter to carry. I arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early because I wanted to see him before he saw me, to have that moment of observation where I could prepare myself emotionally before the actual confrontation. The place was almost empty, just an elderly couple in the corner and a young woman working on a laptop, and I chose a table near the window where I could watch the door while also having an escape route if things got too overwhelming. At exactly 2 p.m., the door opened and a man walked in, who I simultaneously recognized and didn't recognize at all. He had the same tall frame and broad shoulders I remembered, but his hair had gone completely gray. His face was lined with wrinkles that spoke of hard years and difficult choices, and he moved with a careful deliberateness that suggested someone who'd learned to be cautious about every step. Our eyes met across that small cafe, and I saw something in his expression that I didn't expect. It wasn't guilt or shame. It was fear, pure and simple, like he was more terrified of this meeting than I was. Uncle Marcus walked slowly to my table, his hands in his pockets, and when he spoke, his voice was rougher than I remembered, but still unmistakably his. "Isabella, you look so much like your mother did at your age, it's like looking at a ghost," he said, and I felt a flash of anger because how dare he talk about ghosts when he was the one who disappeared and haunted our family for 20 years. I didn't stand up, didn't offer to hug him, just gestured to the chair across from me and said, "You have a lot of explaining to do, and I need you to understand that I'm not here because I forgive you. I'm here because I deserve answers." He nodded slowly, ordered a black coffee from the waitress who appeared beside us, and then looked at me with eyes that held so much pain, I almost felt sorry for him before remembering that I was the one who'd been left behind to deal with the wreckage of his choices. The silence stretched between us for what felt like an eternity, and I realized that this moment, right here, was the culmination of 20 years of questions, anger, and desperate need to understand why. He took a deep breath, wrapped his hands around his coffee cup like he needed something to anchor him, and said the words that would begin unraveling everything I thought I knew about my family. "Isabella, I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because staying would have destroyed your mother, and possibly gotten me killed, and what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to listen to the whole story before you judge me." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and every instinct told me that whatever he was about to reveal, it was going to shatter the fragile understanding I'd built about who my family was and what secrets we'd been keeping. But I nodded, steeling myself for the truth, having no idea that the secret he was hiding was far darker and more complex than anything my imagination had ever conjured during those long, lonely years of wondering. Uncle Marcus started his story by taking me back to a time before I was born, to when he and my mother were young adults navigating a world that I knew nothing about. He told me that my mother, Sarah, had been involved with a man named Richard Castellano before she met my father, a relationship that was intense, passionate, and ultimately dangerous in ways that a young woman in love couldn't see until it was almost too late. Richard was charming, successful, and completely controlling, the kind of man who presents himself as a protector, but slowly tightens his grip until you realize you're not being protected, you're being imprisoned. My mother had fallen deeply in love with him, and by the time she recognized the warning signs, the possessiveness, the explosive anger, the subtle threats disguised as concern, she was already in too deep and terrified of what he might do if she tried to leave. Marcus explained that he'd watched his sister change during that relationship, saw her vibrant personality dim, noticed how she started making excuses for bruises and canceled plans, and realized that Richard was systematically isolating her from everyone who cared about her. Now I want you to pause and think about this for a second, because what I'm about to share gets even more complicated, and it's crucial that you understand the full context of what my family was dealing with. If you're finding this story as shocking as I did when I first heard it, please show your support by subscribing to this channel and hitting that like button, because sharing these difficult stories helps break the silence around family secrets and domestic abuse. Also, I'd love to know in the comments if you've ever discovered something about your parents' past that completely changed how you understood your own history, because that's exactly what was happening to me in that moment. Every word Uncle Marcus spoke was rewriting my understanding of who my mother was, transforming her from the quiet, controlled woman I'd known my whole life into someone who'd survived something terrible and carried those scars in silence. Marcus continued, explaining that he'd confronted Richard one night after my mother showed up at his apartment with a black eye and a split lip, claiming she'd walked into a door but unable to meet her brother's eyes while she said it. The confrontation had been explosive, with Richard threatening Marcus, warning him that if he interfered in their relationship or tried to turn Sarah against him, there would be consequences that Marcus couldn't even imagine. But Marcus didn't back down. Instead, he helped my mother plan an escape, found her a safe place to stay, and supported her through the terrifying process of breaking free from an abusive relationship. For 6 months, they thought they'd succeeded. Richard had apparently moved on, my mother started dating my father David, and life seemed to be returning to normal. Then my mother got pregnant with me, married my father in a small ceremony, and began building the stable, safe life she'd always wanted, and everyone believed that Richard Castellano was finally in the past where he belonged. But here's where the story takes a turn that made my blood run cold when Marcus told me. About 3 months after I was born, Richard showed up at Marcus's workplace, calm and collected, and delivered a message that would change everything. He told Marcus that he knew where my mother lived, knew about her new husband and baby, and that he'd been watching our family with a patience that suggested he'd never really let go at all. Richard made it clear that he considered my mother his property, that her marriage to my father was a temporary inconvenience, and that eventually she would come back to him, whether she wanted to or not. Then he told Marcus something that turned a terrifying situation into a nightmare. He had connections to organized crime, people who owed him favors, and if Marcus or anyone else tried to protect my mother or involve the police, accidents could happen to anyone in our family, including a 3-month-old baby who would be so easy to make disappear. Marcus's voice broke as he told me this part, and I could see tears forming in his eyes as he relived that moment of absolute terror and helplessness. He'd gone immediately to my mother and father, told them everything about Richard's threats, and they'd faced an impossible choice with no good options. Going to the police might trigger the violence Richard had promised. Doing nothing meant living under constant threat, and there seemed to be no way to protect everyone without someone paying a terrible price. That's when Marcus made a decision that would cost him everything. He told Richard that he would leave town, cut off all contact with our family, and stay away permanently if Richard promised to leave us alone and move on with his life. It was a devil's bargain, trading Marcus's presence in our lives for our safety, and Richard had agreed with one condition. If Marcus ever came back or tried to contact us, if he ever broke the agreement, Richard would consider the deal void, and our family would face the consequences. So Uncle Marcus disappeared, sacrificing his relationship with his sister, his chance to watch me grow up, and his entire life as he knew it, all to protect us from a threat we didn't even know existed. Sitting in that cafe, listening to Uncle Marcus explain how he'd sacrificed everything to protect us from a monster we didn't even know was watching, I felt like the ground had opened up beneath me, and I was falling through layers of lies and half-truths that had formed the foundation of my entire life. My mother had known all along where Marcus went and why. She'd carried that guilt and gratitude in silence for 20 years, pretending to be angry at her brother for abandoning us when really she was grieving the loss of someone who'd loved us enough to walk away. My father knew too, which meant that every time I'd asked about Uncle Marcus as a child, every time I'd cried about missing him, they'd had to look me in the eye and lie, choosing to let me believe I'd been abandoned rather than telling me the truth about the danger that had been lurking in our past. I felt betrayed by everyone, Marcus for leaving, my parents for lying, and even by my own memories, which suddenly seemed like elaborate constructions designed to hide a reality too dark for a child to handle. Think about what it would feel like to discover that your entire childhood was built on a foundation of necessary lies, that the people you trusted most had been protecting you by keeping you in the dark about threats you never knew existed. If this story is resonating with you, if you're realizing that maybe your own family has secrets that shaped your life in ways you never understood, please subscribe to this channel and hit that like button, because we're just getting to the part where everything gets even more complicated. I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think my parents made the right choice by keeping this secret from me all these years? Or did I have a right to know the truth even as a child? These are the questions that were tearing me apart as I sat across from Uncle Marcus, trying to process 20 years of deception that had been motivated by love, but still felt like a profound violation of trust. Marcus reached across the table like he wanted to take my hand, but I pulled away because I wasn't ready for physical comfort from someone who was still essentially a stranger to me. He respected the boundary and continued his story, explaining how he'd moved to a different state, changed his last name, and built a completely new life under the shadow of the agreement he'd made with Richard. For the first 5 years, he'd lived in constant fear that Richard would change his mind, that the threats would resurface, that his sacrifice would turn out to be meaningless. He'd hired a private investigator to keep tabs on Richard from a distance, making sure the man was staying away from our family. And for a while, it seemed like the terrible bargain had worked. Richard had moved to another city, apparently started a new business, and seemed to have moved on with his life, leaving my mother, father, and me to live in peace, unaware that we'd ever been in danger at all. But Uncle Marcus couldn't move on, not really, because how do you build a normal life when you've had to cut out everyone you love in order to keep them safe? He described years of loneliness, of watching from afar as I grew up through occasional Facebook photos he'd find on public profiles, of celebrating my birthdays alone and wondering what kind of person I was becoming without him there to be part of my story. He'd dated a few women over the years, but could never fully commit, because how do you explain to someone that you can't introduce them to your family, can't talk about your past, can't ever go back to your hometown because of a deal you made with a dangerous man? It was like he'd been living in a prison of his own making, free to move around physically but emotionally locked in a cage built from sacrifice and secret threats. Think of it like being in witness protection, except nobody else knows you're protecting them. And the danger isn't from criminals you testified against, but from a choice you made to save the people you love. Then, about 6 months ago, everything changed in a way that Marcus had been both dreading and hoping for since the day he left. Richard Castellano died in a car accident, A simple, random tragedy that had nothing to do with the drama he'd caused in our lives decades earlier. Marcus found out through the same private investigator he'd kept on retainer all those years, and for the first time in 20 years, he felt like he could breathe. Like the invisible chains holding him away from his family had finally been broken. He'd spent months debating whether to reach out, terrified that my mother wouldn't want to see him, that I would hate him for the years he'd missed, that reopening old wounds might cause more damage than healing. But ultimately, he decided that we deserved to know the truth, that carrying this secret alone for 2 decades had nearly destroyed him, and that whatever reception he got from us, at least we'd finally understand that he hadn't abandoned us. He'd been protecting us the only way he knew how. And that's why I was sitting in this cafe, listening to a story that was rewriting my entire understanding of my family, my childhood, and the nature of love and sacrifice. After Marcus finished explaining the basics of why he'd left, I just sat there in stunned silence, my coffee growing cold in front of me, trying to process information that seemed too enormous to fit inside my head. Part of me wanted to reach across the table and hug him, to thank him for the sacrifice he'd made, to tell him I understood and forgave him for all the missed years. But a bigger part of me was furious, absolutely enraged that he'd made this decision without giving anyone else a choice, that he'd played hero and martyr while the rest of us lived with the consequences of his absence. Who gave him the right to decide that protecting us was worth destroying the relationship we had? To choose for all of us that safety was more important than family? I asked him these questions, my voice shaking with emotion, demanding to know why he couldn't have found another way, why he'd had to disappear so completely that I spent 20 years thinking I wasn't important enough for him to stay. His answer made me even angrier because it was so frustratingly reasonable and impossible to argue with. He said that Richard had made it clear that any contact, any attempt to maintain a relationship even from a distance, would be seen as breaking the agreement and would put us all at risk. Marcus had consulted with lawyers, with domestic violence experts, with private security professionals, and they'd all told him the same thing. When dealing with someone who has connections to organized crime and has demonstrated obsessive, controlling behavior, the safest option is complete separation. Going to the police might have helped temporarily, but restraining orders are just pieces of paper, and Richard had made it clear he had resources and patience that could outlast any legal protection. So Marcus had chosen the nuclear option, complete erasure from our lives. Because in his mind, my safety and my mother's peace of mind were worth any personal cost to himself. But here's what he didn't understand. His absence had its own cost, and I'd been paying it every single day for 20 years. I told him about the abandonment issues that had plagued my entire adult life, about the relationships I'd sabotaged because I couldn't trust anyone to stay, about the years of therapy trying to understand why I felt fundamentally unlovable and always waiting for people to leave. I told him that while he was playing noble protector, sacrificing himself for our safety, I was growing up believing that I wasn't worth sticking around for, that the first man who'd really loved me had chosen to walk away without explanation. Marcus's face crumpled as I spoke, and I could see that he'd never fully considered the emotional collateral damage his choice would cause, that in saving me from a physical threat I never knew existed, he'd inadvertently created psychological wounds that had shaped my entire personality. It felt good to hurt him with these truths, to make him understand that his sacrifice hadn't been clean or noble. It had been messy and complicated and had left scars on everyone involved, including the niece he'd been trying to protect. But even as I was expressing my anger, doubt was creeping in around the edges, whispering questions that I didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't ignore. What if Marcus was lying? What if this elaborate story about Richard Castellano and organized crime connections was just a convenient excuse for a man who'd wanted to leave and was now looking for forgiveness? I had no proof that any of this had actually happened, just the word of someone who'd already proven he could keep secrets and lie by omission for 20 years. How did I know my mother had really been in an abusive relationship? How did I know Richard had really made those threats? How did I know Marcus hadn't just gotten tired of family responsibilities and created this dramatic narrative to absolve himself of guilt? The doubt felt like poison spreading through my mind, contaminating the story he'd told and making me question every emotion I was feeling, every impulse toward forgiveness or understanding. I looked at Marcus across that table and realized I didn't know him at all anymore, that the uncle I remembered was a 12-year-old's memory, filtered through nostalgia and loss, and this gray-haired stranger could be anyone telling me anything. So I did what any reasonable person would do in my situation. I told him I needed proof, that I couldn't just accept this story on faith after 20 years of silence, that if he wanted any kind of relationship with me going forward, he needed to provide evidence that would support his claims. I needed to talk to my mother, to hear her version of events, to see if the stories matched or if there were inconsistencies that would reveal the truth. Marcus nodded slowly, said he'd expected this reaction and respected it, that he had documentation, old police reports from when my mother had filed complaints against Richard, letters and emails that proved the timeline of events he'd described. He pulled out a folder he'd been carrying and slid it across the table, telling me to take as much time as I needed to verify everything, that he'd waited 20 years and could wait a little longer for me to process and investigate his claims. I left that cafe with the folder Marcus had given me, my mind spinning with questions and my heart heavy with emotions I couldn't even name. The drive home felt like it took hours, even though it was only 20 minutes, and I kept glancing at the folder on my passenger seat like it was a bomb that might explode at any moment. When I finally got home, I sat at my kitchen table and opened it with shaking hands, finding copies of police reports from 28 years ago with my mother's name on them, documenting incidents of domestic disturbance and assault by a Richard Castellano. There were restraining order applications, medical records showing injuries consistent with physical abuse, and even a few photographs that made my stomach turn, showing a younger version of my mother with bruises and cuts that told a story of violence I'd never imagined she'd experienced. Each document felt like a punch to the gut, confirmation that Marcus had been telling the truth, that my mother had survived something terrible before I was even born. But documents can be forged or misinterpreted, and I needed to hear the truth from my mother's own mouth. So I did something I probably should have planned better, but couldn't wait another moment to do. I called my mother and told her I needed to see her immediately, that it was urgent and couldn't wait, and the tone of my voice must have conveyed the seriousness because she agreed without asking questions. An hour later, I was sitting in my childhood living room, the same couch where I'd spent countless hours watching TV and doing homework, facing my mother with the folder of documents spread out on the coffee table between us. Her face went pale when she saw what I had, and I watched her hands start to tremble as she realized that the secret she'd kept for nearly 3 decades was finally coming to light in the worst possible way. I need you to understand something about what happened next, because this is where the story gets even more emotionally complex and difficult to process. Have you ever had to confront your parents about a lie they told you, even when you understand they were trying to protect you, and felt that terrible conflict between love and betrayal? If you're still with me on this journey, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because what my mother told me next changed everything I thought I understood about sacrifice, protection, and the weight of secrets. Drop a comment telling me how you'd handle discovering that your parents had hidden something this massive from you for your entire life, because I'm still not sure I processed it correctly or responded the way I should have. My mother, Sarah, looked at those documents for a long moment before finally meeting my eyes, and I saw something in her expression that I'd never noticed before. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion that suggested she'd been carrying an enormous weight for so long that it had become part of who she was. She started talking in a quiet, steady voice, telling me about Richard Castellano and confirming everything Marcus had said, but adding details that made the story even more horrifying. Richard hadn't just been controlling and violent, he'd been sophisticated about it, charming in public and monstrous in private. The kind of abuser who knows exactly how to isolate his victim and make her believe she's crazy for thinking anything is wrong. My mother described years of walking on eggshells, of making herself smaller and quieter to avoid triggering his rage, of believing that if she could just be perfect enough, he would stop hurting her and become the man he pretended to be when other people were watching. Marcus had saved her life by helping her escape, my mother said with tears streaming down her face. And when Richard had made those threats after I was born, she'd been terrified in a way that civilians who've never dealt with truly dangerous people can't fully comprehend. She'd agreed with Marcus's decision to disappear because she knew Richard well enough to believe every word of his threats, knew that he was patient and vindictive enough to wait years for an opportunity to hurt anyone who'd helped her get away from him. My mother had spent the first decade after Marcus left looking over her shoulder constantly, jumping at unexpected sounds, having nightmares about Richard showing up at our door. And she'd never told me any of this because she wanted me to have a childhood free from that fear. She'd let me be angry at Marcus, let me think he'd abandoned us because that pain seemed manageable compared to the terror of knowing that a dangerous man might be watching our family, waiting for an excuse to act on his threats. Every choice she'd made had been about protecting me, even the choice to lie, even the choice to let me grow up with abandonment issues rather than grow up afraid. After my mother finished talking, we both just sat there crying, 2 women separated by a generation, but connected by the ripple effects of violence and secrets that had shaped both our lives in ways we were only beginning to understand. I realized in that moment that I'd been so focused on my own pain, on what Marcus's absence had cost me, that I'd never really considered what it had cost my mother to lose her brother, while simultaneously trying to protect her daughter from a truth too heavy for a child to carry. She'd been grieving Marcus for 20 years just like I had, but her grief was compounded by guilt by the knowledge that his sacrifice had been necessary because of choices she'd made before I was even born. Think about carrying that weight, loving your brother, missing him every single day, but knowing that his absence was the price of your child's safety, and never being able to talk about it or share that burden with anyone except your spouse. My father, David, came home in the middle of this conversation and found both of us in tears, and I saw the look of resignation on his face as he realized that the secret was finally out. He sat down and added his perspective to the story, explaining that he'd met my mother when she was still healing from the trauma of her relationship with Richard, that he'd known from the beginning about her past, and had agreed to help protect her and eventually me from any potential threat. My father had liked Marcus, had appreciated the sacrifice he'd made, and had carried his own guilt about benefiting from another man's loss, essentially building his family on the foundation of Marcus's exile. He'd wanted to reach out to Marcus over the years to find some way to maintain contact safely, but they'd all agreed that any connection was too risky as long as Richard was alive and potentially watching. So my father had raised me as his daughter, loved me fiercely, and never told me that the stability and safety of my childhood had been purchased at the cost of my uncle's entire life. Sitting there with both my parents, hearing the full story from all angles, I felt something shift inside me, a slow, painful recalibration of my understanding of family, loyalty, and the terrible choices people sometimes have to make to protect the ones they love. I was still angry, still hurt, still struggling with the betrayal of being lied to for so long, but I was also beginning to understand the impossible position they'd all been in, trapped between truth and safety with no good options. What would I have done in their place? Would I have told a child that a dangerous man might be watching our family, that her beloved uncle had to disappear to keep her safe? Would I have burdened a kid with that knowledge and the fear that would come with it? Or would I have made the same choice they did, to carry the weight myself and let my child be innocent and unafraid, even if it meant she'd grow up with different scars? But understanding doesn't automatically equal forgiveness, and I told my parents that while I could intellectually grasp why they'd made the choices they did, I needed time to process the emotional impact of learning that my entire life had been built on a lie, even if it was a well-intentioned one. I needed space to figure out who I was now that I knew the truth, to reassess my relationship with all of them, Marcus included, and to decide what kind of future we could build on this foundation of revealed secrets. My mother reached for my hand, and I let her take it, feeling the decades of love and protection and guilt flowing between us in that touch, and she told me she understood, that she'd give me whatever time and space I needed, that she'd been preparing for this conversation in her head for 20 years and knew it wouldn't be easy or simple. Before I left my parents' house that evening, I asked the question that had been nagging at me since Marcus first told me his story. Why had he come back now? Why not wait another year or 5 or 10 to make sure Richard's death wasn't some kind of trick? My father explained that Marcus had been diagnosed with a serious heart condition 6 months ago, right around the time Richard died, and the doctors had told him that while treatment might give him more years, there were no guarantees about how much time he had left. Marcus had decided that he couldn't risk dying without at least trying to reconnect with his family, without making sure we understood that his absence had been an act of love rather than abandonment, without getting the chance to know the niece he'd sacrificed so much to protect. So his return wasn't just about Richard being gone. It was also about mortality, about a man facing his own ending, and desperate to repair what he could before it was too late. And that knowledge added another layer of complexity to the situation, because now I wasn't just deciding whether to forgive someone who'd left, I was deciding whether to build a relationship with someone who might not be around much longer, and the pressure of that timeline made everything feel even more urgent and overwhelming. The weeks following those revelations were some of the hardest of my life, because suddenly I was carrying the weight of knowledge that explained so much about my past, but also required me to completely rebuild my understanding of who I was and where I came from. I'd spent 20 years constructing an identity around being someone who'd been abandoned, someone who wasn't worth staying for, and now I had to dismantle that entire narrative and replace it with something much more complicated. The truth was that I had been incredibly loved, so loved that a man had given up his entire life to keep me safe from a threat I never even knew existed, and my parents had carried the burden of that secret to spare me from fear. But somehow, knowing I'd been protected didn't erase the pain I'd felt all those years, didn't magically heal the abandonment issues or the relationship problems or the deep-seated belief that people leave. It just added layers of complexity to wounds that were already there. I started seeing Marcus regularly, meeting him for coffee or lunch about once a week, and slowly getting to know him as an adult, rather than through the filter of childhood memories. He told me about his life over the past 20 years, the jobs he'd worked, the places he'd lived, the hobbies he'd developed to fill the void where family should have been. He'd become a woodworker, creating beautiful furniture in a small workshop, and he said that working with his hands, building something solid and permanent, had been the only thing that kept him sane during the loneliest years. He showed me pictures of pieces he'd made, intricate tables and chairs and cabinets, and I realized that while I'd been growing up without him, he'd been channeling his grief and love into creating beautiful things, as if by building enough solid objects, he could somehow make up for the relationship that had been torn apart. Here's what I need you to consider as we move forward with this story, because this is where my journey really begins to shift from anger towards something more complex. Have you ever had to forgive someone not because they asked for it or even deserved it, but because holding on to the anger was hurting you more than it was hurting them? If you're invested in seeing how this story resolves, if you want to know whether Isabella can truly forgive Marcus and rebuild their relationship, please subscribe to this channel and smash that like button, because we're approaching the emotional climax of this entire journey. I want to hear in the comments about your own experiences with forgiveness, especially when it involves family members who made choices that hurt you even though their intentions were good, because your stories and perspectives have helped me process my own complicated feelings about all of this. Forgiveness, I was learning, isn't a single moment or decision. It's a process, a daily choice to let go of resentment and anger, even when part of you still wants to hold on to it. Some days I'd sit with Marcus and feel nothing but warmth and gratitude for the sacrifice he'd made, seeing him as a hero who'd loved me enough to walk away. Other days I'd look at him and feel a surge of anger for all the moments he'd missed. My high school graduation, my first heartbreak, my college years, all the times I desperately needed an uncle's advice or support and had to navigate life without him. He seemed to understand that forgiveness wasn't linear, that I might move forward one day and backward the next, and he never pressured me or asked for more than I was ready to give, just showed up consistently and let me set the pace of our reconciliation. One afternoon, about 2 months after that first cafe meeting, Marcus invited me to his workshop to show me something he'd been working on. When I arrived, he led me to a corner where a beautiful wooden hope chest sat, carved with intricate designs that included my name, my birth date, and scenes from childhood: a girl learning to ride a bike, a girl reading a book under a tree, a girl graduating in cap and gown. Marcus explained that he'd started carving this chest the year after he left, adding to it every year on my birthday, creating a record of the life he imagined I was living even though he couldn't be there to witness it. Some of the scenes were accurate. Apparently he'd managed to get information somehow over the years, but others were pure imagination, his hopes for what kind of person I was becoming. Inside the chest were 20 birthday cards, one for each year he'd been gone, written and sealed but never sent, along with small gifts he'd collected, books he thought I'd like, jewelry he'd chosen, photographs of places he wished he could have taken me. It was a shrine to the relationship we should have had, and standing there looking at this physical representation of his love and grief, I finally broke down completely and cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child. That hope chest became a turning point for me, a tangible symbol that Marcus had never really left us, not in his heart, even when he'd had to leave physically. I spent hours going through the cards and gifts, reading his words to a niece he couldn't reach, seeing how his handwriting had changed over the years, noticing how the early cards were full of pain and the later ones had evolved into a sort of peaceful acceptance. He'd written about his life, about things he wished he could teach me, about his hopes for my future, and reading those cards was like getting to know a version of him that had existed all along, just outside my awareness. In one card from when I would have been 16, he wrote about hoping I'd be kind to myself during my teenage years, that I'd know my worth even when the world made me doubt it, and I sobbed because those were exactly the years when I'd struggled most with self-esteem and feeling unlovable, and here was evidence that someone had been thinking about me, rooting for me, even from a distance. My relationship with my parents also began to shift during this time, because I was starting to see them not just as the people who'd lied to me, but as human beings who'd been doing their best in an impossible situation. My mother opened up more about her past, about what it was like to escape an abusive relationship and live with the fear that the abuser might come back, and I began to understand the hypervigilance I'd always noticed in her, the way she checked locks twice and hated surprises and needed to know where I was at all times when I was growing up. Those weren't just quirks or overprotective parenting, they were trauma responses, the lasting effects of violence and the constant low-level fear that Richard might return. My father shared that he'd struggled with feeling like he was living in another man's shadow, that Richard's ghost had been present in their marriage even though he'd never met the man, and that Marcus's sacrifice had also been a gift that allowed my father to build a family without constant threat. Understanding the legacy of trauma and how it ripples through families across years and generations became crucial to my healing process. I started reading about domestic violence, about how abuse affects not just the victim, but everyone connected to them, about how the impacts can last decades after the physical danger has passed. I learned about complex PTSD, about hypervigilance and trust issues, about how children of abuse survivors often carry anxiety and abandonment fears, even when they've never directly experienced violence themselves. It helped me understand that my issues weren't just about Marcus leaving. They were about growing up in a household where my mother's unprocessed trauma had created an atmosphere of unspoken tension, where love was demonstrated through control and protection rather than freedom and trust, where the underlying message was that the world was dangerous and people couldn't be trusted. I wasn't just healing from one man's absence, I was healing from the intergenerational impacts of violence and secrets. I also began to see how the secret had shaped my parents' marriage and their parenting style in ways I'd never recognized before. They'd been united by a shared mission to protect me, which had created a strong partnership but also meant that their entire family structure was built around fear and vigilance rather than joy and openness. They'd made decisions based not on what would help me thrive but on what would keep me safe, which meant I'd grown up in an environment that was secure but also somewhat stifled, where taking risks or being too visible felt dangerous even though I didn't understand why. My mother's refusal to let me do certain activities, her insistence on knowing all my friends' parents, her intense monitoring of my social media, all of it suddenly made sense as the actions of someone who knew firsthand how dangerous the world could be and was determined to prevent her daughter from ever experiencing what she'd survived. But here's what was most profound about this realization. Understanding the legacy didn't excuse the impact, but it did provide context that made forgiveness possible. I could hold two truths simultaneously: that my family had loved me and done their best to protect me, and that the choices they'd made to keep me safe had also hurt me in ways they hadn't intended or foreseen. I could acknowledge that Marcus's sacrifice was noble while also recognizing that it had costs that affected multiple generations. I could appreciate my mother's strength in surviving abuse, while also addressing my own need to heal from growing up in the aftermath of her trauma. Forgiveness wasn't about pretending the pain didn't exist or that everything was fine. It was about accepting the full complexity of what had happened and choosing to move forward with compassion for everyone involved, including myself. About 4 months into my reconnection with Marcus, I realized that there were still pieces of the story that didn't quite add up, questions that nagged at me in quiet moments when I was alone with my thoughts. If Richard had been as dangerous as everyone claimed, why hadn't there been more attempts to contact my mother over the years? Why had he seemingly accepted Marcus's deal so easily and moved on with his life? I'd done some research on my own, looking up Richard Castellano online, and found obituaries and business records that painted a picture of a successful entrepreneur who'd been active in his community, donated to charities, and seemed to have led a normal, unremarkable life after my mother left him. It didn't match the image of a violent stalker with organized crime connections, and the discrepancy bothered me more than I wanted to admit, planting seeds of doubt that I couldn't quite uproot no matter how much I wanted to believe Marcus's story completely. So I did something that might have been reckless but felt necessary for my own peace of mind. I hired my own private investigator to look into Richard Castellano's life after my mother left him. I didn't tell Marcus or my parents what I was doing because I didn't want them to feel like I didn't trust them. But the truth was, I needed independent verification of the narrative I'd been given. Needed to know that the story holding my family together was built on facts rather than fear and assumptions. The investigator came back 3 weeks later with a report that was both validating and troubling in equal measure. Richard had indeed had connections to organized crime in his younger years, working as an accountant for several businesses that were later investigated for money laundering, though he'd never been charged with anything. He'd been questioned by police multiple times in connection with various illegal activities, but he'd always managed to stay just outside the reach of prosecution, which suggested he was either very careful or very well connected. But here's where things got complicated. After my mother left him, Richard seemed to have genuinely changed his life, or at least the public-facing version of it. He'd cut ties with the questionable businesses, started legitimate companies, married someone else, had children of his own, and by all accounts became a pillar of his community. The investigator found no evidence that he'd tried to contact my mother or our family after Marcus made his deal. No signs of surveillance or stalking, nothing that suggested he'd been actively threatening us for the past 2 decades. Either Marcus's sacrifice had worked exactly as intended, and Richard had kept his word about leaving us alone, or the threat had never been as ongoing or severe as my family had believed it to be. I found myself caught between 2 interpretations. Was Marcus a hero who'd made a necessary sacrifice that kept us safe, or was he someone who'd made an extreme choice based on a threat that had faded much sooner than anyone realized, meaning he could have come back years ago but chose not to? When I confronted Marcus with this information, expecting him to be defensive or upset that I'd investigated behind his back, he surprised me by seeming almost relieved. He admitted that he'd often wondered the same thing, that as the years passed and Richard seemed to move on, he'd questioned whether he'd overreacted, whether his sacrifice had been necessary, or if he'd let fear make him more cautious than the situation required. But the problem, he explained, was that there was no way to know for sure. No way to test whether Richard's apparent change was genuine or just a patient man waiting for an opportunity. The stakes were too high to gamble with, because if Marcus had been wrong and had tried to return earlier, if Richard had still been dangerous and had followed through on his threats, the consequences could have been catastrophic. So Marcus had erred on the side of caution, choosing to stay away even when he desperately wanted to come home, living with the uncertainty and the possibility that he'd sacrificed more than was strictly necessary because the alternative, risking our safety to satisfy his own need for family, was unthinkable. This conversation opened up a new dimension to my understanding of Marcus's choice and the nature of sacrifice itself. He hadn't just given up 20 years to protect us from a clear and present danger. He'd given up 20 years to protect us from the possibility of danger, from a threat that might or might not have persisted, and he'd done so knowing he might never be certain whether his sacrifice had been necessary or excessive. That kind of choice requires a different kind of courage, not the courage to face a known enemy, but the courage to live with uncertainty and ambiguity, to make the most conservative choice even when it costs you everything, to accept that you might be wrong, but decide that being wrong on the side of caution is better than being wrong in a way that gets someone hurt. I realized that I'd been judging Marcus's choice based on outcomes I could see now, with the benefit of hindsight and information he didn't have at the time, and that wasn't entirely fair to the impossible position he'd been in 20 years ago, when he'd had to make a decision with incomplete information and devastating potential consequences. Armed with the investigator's report and Marcus's honest acknowledgement of his own doubts, I decided it was time to have a family meeting where we could all discuss the full complexity of what had happened, rather than maintaining the simplified narrative of heroic sacrifice. My parents, Marcus, and I gathered at my apartment on a Saturday afternoon, and I laid out everything I'd learned, including the evidence that Richard had moved on with his life and the possibility that Marcus's exile might not have needed to last as long as it did. The atmosphere was tense because nobody wants to confront the possibility that decades of pain and separation might have been partially unnecessary, that the story you've been telling yourself to make sense of loss might be more complicated than you thought. My mother's reaction was the most intense, because accepting that Richard might have genuinely changed after she left meant confronting her own trauma responses and recognizing that fear had potentially kept our family apart longer than necessary. She became defensive at first, insisting that we couldn't possibly understand how dangerous Richard had been, that even if he'd appeared to change, abusers don't really change, they just get better at hiding their true nature. I watched her struggle with the cognitive dissonance of wanting to believe that Marcus's sacrifice had been absolutely necessary, while also beginning to see that maybe, just maybe, fear had made all of them more cautious than they needed to be after the first few years. It was painful to watch because I could see her having to reckon with the possibility that her unprocessed trauma had contributed to keeping her brother away, that if she'd been able to heal and overcome her fear of Richard, they might have found a way to reconnect sooner. My father took a different approach, immediately accepting the possibility that they'd been overly cautious and expressing regret that they hadn't tried harder to find a middle ground, some way for Marcus to be part of our lives even from a distance. He talked about the letters Marcus could have sent through intermediaries, the phone calls that could have happened on special occasions, the ways they might have maintained some connection while still being careful about direct contact. Dad seemed almost angry with himself for not thinking creatively about solutions, for accepting the nuclear option of complete separation when there might have been other approaches they could have tried. I appreciated his willingness to take responsibility, but I also recognized that hindsight is always clearer than the moment of crisis, and judging past decisions with present knowledge isn't entirely fair to the people who had to make those choices under pressure and fear. Marcus, for his part, was the calmest person in the room, which surprised me until I realized he'd been having this internal debate with himself for 20 years. He said that regardless of whether his choice had been perfectly calibrated to the actual level of threat, he'd made the best decision he could with the information he had at the time, and that he'd rather have erred on the side of caution and unnecessarily sacrificed his own happiness than have taken risks that could have resulted in harm to people he loved. He acknowledged that fear might have kept him away longer than was strictly necessary, that pride and stubbornness might have also played a role in his continued absence once the immediate threat had clearly passed, and that he bore responsibility for not trying harder to find alternative ways to maintain connection. But he also said something that shifted the entire tone of the conversation, that focusing on whether his choice had been perfectly necessary was missing the point, because the real question wasn't whether he'd sacrificed exactly the right amount, but what we were going to do now with the time we had left. That reframing was exactly what we needed, because we'd been so focused on analyzing the past that we were losing sight of the present and future. Marcus's health issues meant that obsessing over whether he should have come back 5 years earlier or 10 years earlier was wasting the precious time we actually had together now. My mother started crying and apologizing to her brother for not finding a way to bring him home sooner, and Marcus hugged her and told her there was nothing to apologize for, that they'd all been doing their best to navigate an impossible situation. My father joined the embrace, and then I did too, and we all stood there in my living room, 4 people bound by blood and secrets and sacrifice, finally acknowledging the full messy complexity of what had happened instead of trying to fit it into a clean narrative of heroes and villains. It wasn't a moment of perfect resolution because healing doesn't work that way, but it was a moment of honest reckoning with the truth, and sometimes that's all you can ask for when dealing with family trauma that spans decades.